everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before I turn it over to Andrea, I just want to go over a few upcoming events that we have as part of CHAMP. My name is Paige Beliveau, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. To mute your line, please press *6, and unmute, please press #6. We have a few upcoming 4-hour clinical skills trainings. There will be one at Merit Health Natchez on Tuesday, October 23rd.
When you put the code in.
Just a second. And another at UMMC Grenada on November 2nd. You can register for these trainings at cheerequity.org/trainings. And for our fall webinar schedule, November 7th will be Safe Formula Preparation Education, when to talk about it and who needs it, which will be presented by CHAMPS Hospitals and our own Laura Burnham, who is the project manager here at CHEER. And on December 5th, we'll have Baby Friendly USA discusses updates to the 10 steps, and that will be presented by representatives from Baby Friendly. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea. If you have any questions, please wait until the end. You can use the chat box to type them out, and when Andrea has finished her presentation, I'll read them out loud and she can answer them. Thanks.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining me on this particular webinar titled Advancing Equity in Breastfeeding and Our Community. Just to give a little bit of background, I am the program director at Reaching Our Sisters Everywhere, and our work involved with CHAMPS is addressing the community involvement as a part of the hospital's advancing maternity practices. So we are the C in community. The mission for Reaching Our Sisters Everywhere is we are a member network founded to address breastfeeding inequities among people of color nationwide through culturally competent training, education, advocacy, and support, with a focus on increasing breastfeeding initiation and duration rates. ROSE seeks to normalize breastfeeding by serving as a catalyst that provides resources and networking opportunities for individuals and communities. And so with that said, before I jump into the information and everything, I want to give you all a round of applause for the work that has collectively been done in Mississippi. And as the train continues to move forward with addressing maternal infant health practices, because throughout this time with working with CHAMPS and working with the communities, visually a difference can be seen. And I want to point out that when Rose first came in to do what we call community transformer trainings, which are the community-based breastfeeding peer counselor trainings, our first training was in the Mississippi Delta in December of 2014. And one of the questions that we often ask at these trainings, we ask the ladies who are participating, who are ladies that have breastfed for at least 6 months in the past 5 years, we ask them how many of them received breastfeeding information from their providers while pregnant. And at that time in 2014, when we first asked that question, we didn't see too many hands raised up high. And one of the most recent trainings we did, and this is in Jackson at the Roadmap to Health Equity, when we asked that same question, pretty much all hands have gone up, right? So this is visually being able to see the differences that the work that's collectively been done in Mississippi, real time, seeing these changes and even hearing different stories from the ladies that we have worked and supported in the community. So I want to reinforce that everyone is making a difference, that this work that you all are doing collectively, it is definitely making an impact. And so for this call, in the realms of advancing equity, I'm going to be sharing some tools that Rose received from the Center of Social Inclusion, and this was a First Food Racial Equity cohort in which the training was centered around addressing racial equity to reduce disparities. And so I want to share some of the tools with all of you on the call today as you go forward and continue to do the phenomenal work that's been done in Mississippi. I come from a strong point that knowledge is a power meant to be shared, and so I'm taking this opportunity to share with you. So as mentioned earlier, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. I really want this to be an opportunity for learning some new tools and at least folks feeling comfortable to put them in place in real time. So, jumping in, what do we see in our communities? Well, if we look at the Healthy People 2020 objectives, this is the most recent breastfeeding report card. We are seeing that as a nation that we are hitting many of the targets, objectives, many of the targets that was outlined in the Healthy People 2020 goal as a nation, right? And we would celebrate that. When we look more deeply at Mississippi, here I pulled the breastfeeding report cards from 2012 on up to the current one of 2018. And one of the things that, once again, to celebrate is the increase in the percentages around ever breastfed, along with breastfeeding at 6 months, breastfeeding at 12 months. Like, essentially, pretty much on each of the markers, there have been an increase in the rates for Mississippi according to the 2018 breastfeeding report card. And I know for sure with the work that's being done that we will continue to see these numbers rise. Now, nationally, around breastfeeding initiation rates and it being divvied out by rates, it has been a longstanding issue that non-Hispanic Black infants have, as the rates are increasing in breastfeeding initiation. However, there has been a persistent gap in between non-Hispanic Black infants and all other race and ethnicities. And so when we look at some of these rates a little deeper, we can see that over the time from 2014, that gap hasn't narrowed. And nationally, you know, when the CDC reported this information, so this data is coming from the CDC, that even in the most recent report card, it hasn't narrowed or closed. And this is for ever breastfed. When we look at breastfeeding rates, as far as exclusively at 6 months, that the gap has widened, and even at 12 months, the gap has continued to widen, right? And so in 2014, when we're looking at, okay, this juncture in time, 2014 is when a robust amount of work gone out into the field to expand the work around breastfeeding, right? The various grants, various initiatives, going forward to have community and hospital engagement around breastfeeding. And we see that, yes, breastfeeding rates were increasing, but at the same time, the gap between white and Black infants was widening, right? So there was something that was missing in some of the approaches to ensure that the gap didn't widen, that as things were working and as initiatives were being drawn out, that it wasn't leaving anyone out of the work. And like the saying sometimes go, rising tide floats all boats. But if a particular group is missing a boat, they sink down as opposed to rise, right? For Mississippi, this data is ranging from for infants born between 2009 through 2011 collectively, and the only way I'm able to pull the demographic information from the CDC is that these are the birth years that they give. So this is the most recent information that they have. But we can see that there is an inequity between percents of infants who are breastfed, ever breastfed, and even those at 6 months between non-Hispanic white infants and non-Hispanic Black infants. And I will say that in looking at some of the CHAMPS data that has come through on, some of the hospital practices for rooming in and breastfeeding exclusivity, that we are seeing that through some of the practices and policy changes that these gaps are narrowing, right? And so hopefully when time comes for updated data from the CDC, that we can see, we'll see that these percentage differences won't be as evident. That's what I'm predicting, but there are some work that can continue to be done to help ensure that the gap continues to narrow. So why do these disparities exist? The most simplest way to kind of frame it is the impact that policies and institutions have on how resources are distributed, how practices are conducted, and some of the examples that we might see how policies affect the overall health of our communities. We can look at examples of the Federal Housing Administration during a time of redlining and what that meant to where communities were concentrated and where resources were allocated to communities. When we look at locations of facilities, quite often, so this map shows the DC trash transfer, and so what it's highlighting is that in communities of color, and that's represented by the darker green areas, that there's often more of the trash waste facilities in those communities. And it might be a little difficult to see in this map, but those yellow dots within in that image represents where all the trash facilities are located, right? And so trash facilities don't just pop up anywhere. It is as a result of policies and where they become designated or allocated to. And then in the interstate system, right, we know that quite often interstates, highways, and so forth are generally built right through communities of color. And so what are some of the implications behind that? That would mean more exposure to smog, to the various chemicals from that, along with displacement when roads and pathways are made, and also even accessibility to being able to navigate your city, right? So these are examples of how certain policies, when done, impact the community, and sometimes impact particularly some particular communities more than others, right? And so the question becomes, well, why do we name race as a factor in this? Why not socioeconomics, such as, income, education, so on and so forth? Well, what we know is that in most data sets, when you look at graphs and you look at where health issues are or where income issues are and so on and so forth, that race often predicts how well you will do, right? That we will often see that communities of color represented on charts usually have are listed amongst the poor health outcomes and so forth, highest among infant mortality. And so it's something more underlining than the issue of class or economics or level of education, because even in certain circumstances where they draw data and try to account for education and so forth, that race continues to be a differential. And so some key facts about race is a construct, right? That the notions and ideas built around race is really more of a modern idea. This is not something that, in a sense, is biologically determined, because race was created, right? The idea of who is what in that assignment and so forth was all more of a modern creation and idea. And so what happens is policy then drives that same social construct and has contributed to the changes and ideas that we see about race over time. So some examples of this would be the one-drop rule to determine if you would be categorized as Black, things on, the different variations of what determined, okay, whether this person is Black or not in different states, right? That in crossing over state lines at a certain point in our history, that you can go from either being categorized as Black in one area to being white in other, right? So this is examples of how policy played a role. And historically, these things have happened. So although none of us was here to build that system, the work that we try to strive and do is addressing that system, the responsibility to address it, to help dismantle it, and work towards achieving the best health for our communities. And so in order to put any of the tools to use, in order to start addressing racial equity in our communities, is we have to set a shared context, right? We all have to have the same definitions. It's important that as we move together, that we are moving together on the same page, okay? And so this process in practice is, the first step is normalizing. So in order to normalize, we have to have a shared analysis and definition of certain key terms and words. For example, if I say equity, a banker would take a definition of equity completely different than what I might mean, right? So we want to ensure that as we're moving forward with utilizing tools to advance equity in our community, that we are all on the same page on what certain terms mean, and also looking at what are the issues in our community, right? Identifying the needs, doing a needs assessment, and then from there, all being on board for identifying what is a priority to address and identifying the urgency. After that step, the organizing. The work done internally, so if you are within an organization or institution, what work needs to be done internally, who needs to be a part of this process, and setting up accountability, who would be responsible for what aspect of the actions or implementing of tools, but also understanding the importance of our partners, right, and partnerships, because there's some things that within our own organization, our own entity, that we're not able to do, or as a resource we're not able to offer, but through partnership that's complementary can help drive forth drive forward the mission, the action that we are pushing forward to do to address equity and support in our community. And after we have set up the organizing and accountability structures, we move forward towards implementing of the racial equity tools and also utilizing data to drive our results. So the data is necessary to see, okay, where are we at a baseline? What is the problem truly being highlighted? What are we seeing? Utilizing data to do that, and then also allowing that data to keep us on track for levels of improvement. And so the cycle continues. This is not a linear process. You know, as you address one priority or one urgency first, then when it's time to cycle back to the other things identified that need to be worked on to advance breastfeeding and breastfeeding support in our community, that we revisit this cycle. So much of this work is processed through 3 different categories. So you have individual racism, which, as it says, is individual person prejudgment, bias, discrimination based on race. Then there's institutional racism, which is policies and practice and procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, often intentionally or inadvertently. And then structural racism, which lends to a history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions. So basically, structural racism is a combination of institutional racism. And in doing this work to advance equity, we're not looking to the individual, right? That is, there's a lot that sometimes can shut down the process and progress when individually people feel that they are individually being called out as being racist or practicing racism, and sometimes can disrupt this process towards addressing equity. So instead, this effort and the tools that will be discussed is really looking at addressing it at the institutional level, and thereby by addressing it at the institutional level, it also then addresses it at the structural level. And this is where we see policy changes come into effect. So for example, with the process towards moving towards baby-friendly designation, that, that the policies along with that state that everyone gets breastfeeding education prenatally, that everyone gets breastfeeding support after delivery, that we have skin-to-skin, that is the policy applied to all individuals that are getting care at this delivery hospital, right? So that policy in itself is applying to institutional changes that is helping to advance equity. And so I've mentioned equity a few times. I just want to ensure that, as discussed, that we are all on the same page when we talk about it. So the definition of equity is, it involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives, right? While equality aims to ensure that everyone gets the same thing in order to enjoy full, healthy lives. So like equity, equality aims to promote fairness and justice, but it only works if everyone starts at the same point, right? So with this image of the escalator, right, if the top of the escalator is the enjoyment of full, healthy lives, if everyone steps onto that escalator at the same time, and the escalator using the same speed and same mechanism, then that would demonstrate equality and everyone would get to that point of full, healthy lives. However, what we know in the data that we look at when it comes to even using breastfeeding rates as an example, that we're not all starting at the same point. And so the involvement of equity in this example would be that we would see the needs and adjust the escalator accordingly so that way everyone could get and reach to full healthy lives, right? And whether that means that the escalator on one side has to move just a bit faster, one moves at one speed or so forth, it's not taken away from anyone, but just adding elements to help propel that population for helping to meet the needs so everyone can achieve full healthy lives. And one of the best real-time examples we could see how equity has been at play is these days you really cannot go too many places without seeing a dip in the sidewalk, right? If you go somewhere you don't see a dip in the sidewalk, you know, your eyebrow might raise and say, okay, what's going on here? Why isn't there a dip in the sidewalk here? And so we know that the intentions on putting dips in the sidewalk was put in place for our brothers and sisters that are differently abled, you know, that might move around via, you know, wheelchair or, you know, other different assistive devices. And without the dips in the sidewalk, that our differently abled brothers and sisters will have to navigate their city in a much different way than those that don't have to worry about stepping on and off a curb, right? And so for, you know, those that need assistive devices, you know, they would have to find a driveway to go down to get across the street, or, you know, the time it took them to navigate their own city took a lot longer. And so work was put in place to ensure that cities had dips in the sidewalks to accommodate this need. And in doing so, in addressing the population most impacted, right, addressing the population that are differently able and need to navigate the city in a more efficient way, this change provided benefits to many others. So families with strollers, right, having to go from one sidewalk to the next without having to kind of place their foot down and kick up the stroller a little bit to get over a curb. If you were traveling, needing to get from one sidewalk to the next, and, you know, luggage. And those of you that do events and you know you have to carry a lot of stuff and you're rolling things around, you know, having that dip in the sidewalk kind of helps without having to lift things up over a curb. And even individuals who shouldn't necessarily be rolling through with a skateboard or bike, but it still makes their transition from one sidewalk to the next more efficient, right? And so this is the framework of what it means to address equity, right? And this also is a great example when you are having to maybe explain this concept to, you know, others as well, because sometimes there's a little bit of a fear of, if I am providing support, resource, and needs to one particular group or whatever that group identifier might be, there's a fear that that means someone else is losing out, right? But in addressing equity, that is not how the framework is built. The framework is built so that way there is this deep understanding that in addressing the need of those most impacted, that not only are we meeting those needs, but it is broadening the help and assistance for many other groups as well as a result. And so this might mean where we consider breastfeeding clubs, where we consider the placement of other community resources, right? That if we know some of the issues that comes into play with those attending breastfeeding clubs or other resource supported groups is transportation or accessibility based off of parking and so on and so forth, that if we consider, all right, for this community, in order to meet their needs, we might need to provide this resource in a much closer space that's easier to get to. And so meaning that need, not only is that particular community gaining better access to a resource, but all of those living within that community is then also gaining better access. And so that's the framework that we take on addressing equity and how we move forward in advancing equity in our community. And so when we bring it towards racial equity, the definition of racial equity is when our institutions and systems work individually and together to benefit all people, regardless of racial and ethnic background. So earlier I discussed how when we look at graphs and data about health issues and so forth, we know that in looking at them, we can see the differences played out by race, right? And so in achieving racial equity, those differences, those gaps would not exist, right? Because everyone would have been able to reach full, healthy lives. And so to help kind of bring in the introduction of some of the tools, right, the first piece is understanding how we think as people in general, right? There is a lot of things that come our way. There's a lot of stimuli that we get at one time. And if we had to be attuned to every piece of information, it would be overwhelming. The lights flickering above us, the temperature of the room, the feeling of our hands against the desk, the sound, you know, there's a lot of different things that come our way. And so what we do as humans is that we quickly create individual and collective meaning. And this is just a part of also just our survival mechanism, you know, being able to quickly identify that, all right, this is a chair I can sit down, you know, without needing to look at each component of it, or going into a space, you know, when you walk into a room and you're wondering if you went into the right meeting room, you know, you just quickly scan around and be like, okay, the slides that I'm seeing up there is what I wanted to hear. So yes, I am quickly putting together that this is the space I need to be in without having to individually try to put together every piece of the room. And that's just how we work as humans, is we quickly have to gather stimuli and create meaning with it. And so through that, we develop these schemas, right? And so schemas is just kind of how we categorize things. And most of it resides in our subconscious. It's not something that we just forwardly think about. So when I use the term millennial, and I ask you, picture a millennial, you know, tell me if I'm wrong, but did most people picture somebody with a phone, you know, in their hand, standing around that, you know, kind of comes off as a person, you know, young person that thinks they know everything, right? So we have these categories we kind of build up of people, right? And that is, once again, just how we quickly take in information and just apply it. And so the thing about that is a lot of our schemas is set up by our environment. So when I had did this example with a different group, some of the participants in the group were exchange students from Germany. And the term, you know, millennials wasn't something that fit within their environment. So when I use that term, they're kind of perplexed, like, what's a millennial? I don't understand that, right? And so for them, their environment, millennial wasn't a category, right? It wasn't a part of their environment, their social norms. And so it wasn't a term that they could easily picture what this person would look like. versus here in the U.S., we use millennials quite often in all the different terms that when saying that word, we can easily generate an image of what that type of person would look like. And so an extra layer of that is that, you know, it helps us kind of establish what are our biases, right? And everyone carries biases. A part of this was also just like a safety net for us in general, you know, being able to identify, okay, whether a situation was good to approach or something I needed to stay away from, you know, just evaluating our environment. And so when biases are placed on a particular group of people, how things are carried out and in practice can lead to negative outcomes and can lead to discriminatory practices, right? And so for some, there is an urge that when a bias is recognized, that they try to suppress it and say, no, I don't carry any biases. You know, this does not exist within me. I don't have any biases. And what happens is, because remember, a lot of this operates in our subconscious, is that it increases the prejudice rather than eliminates it. And so a part of moving forward in the work is recognizing that if a bias arises, whether, you know, within ourselves, that's important that we acknowledge that bias and then work towards addressing it, right? This is one of the steps that is necessary toward advancing equity, is that a part of it is also being honest with ourselves and how we approach the work, because that's the only way we'll be able to find our own hurdles and move around it, right? Because the truth of the matter is we all carry bias. So what can we do to disrupt trends and patterns that might perpetuate inequities? Well, one of the things that is an element but not the only answer is diversity, right? We have to diversify who's at our table when we're doing collective work or who's missing. And that key part of diversity also has to include the sharing of the power of decision making, right? And understanding that all the table could be diverse if the ability to share and everyone be able to be involved in the process, if that is not there, then just having different people around the table is not enough. It has to be approached with mutual respect and reciprocity that all involve benefit from a partnership, but it's also important to ensure that the decision-making is also shared amongst that group. And so once you have looked at your team of partners, whether that is internally or externally, we can start delving into the racial equity tool process. And so the first question to ask is, what is the desired result? In this case, you know, we are not only looking at breastfeeding initiation, but also duration, right? For those of you that work within the hospital, you know, you'll be with the family for 1, 2 days, maybe 3, right? And so we know that the strength and support around initiation will happen there, but then there's also the component of duration, right? And ensuring that as the family leaves the hospital, that they enter into a community of support. And so if we're looking at that as desired results, we have to analyze, okay, what's going on? Where are we at now? what is our initiation rate looking like now, and then with community partners and so forth, being able to analyze what's going on in the community as well. The community engagement piece is essential in that many of the solutions to what may be identified as problems come from within the community. The community can identify, one, what is a true barrier, what is causing a roadblock to their breastfeeding journey, and then also serve as the answers to ways to address that, right? So community engagement has to be a part of the process. And then strategies for racial equity is that keeping in mind that race does play a role, and that if we're going to collect data, we have to also collect data on race, so that way we could see if a gap does exist and perhaps what are ways and solutions to help narrow that gap. And then the implementation plan is created, how we're going to take the solutions and ideas that were developed through, a collective engagement with community and partners and put them into play, and communication and accountability. So who is responsible for what? Because we all know sometimes we can list off things and, okay, this is what has to get done. And when it's not assigned to a person, we come back to that step. We're like, well, what happened to doing, step 4? And folks are like, oh, well, I thought such and such was going to do it. So we have to set up accountability, who's responsible for what, and maintaining lines of communication. And it's important to always revisit this process, okay? Revisiting the process through utilizing this racial equity tool. And then the other piece is looking at our organization, our institution, and really the step that is highlighted in red, institutional implicit, policies that negatively impact one group unintentionally, is where the biggest work can be done, right? And so if we have an example of my facility hosts breastfeeding club, and I'm not getting the turnout I'd like to see. So if we look at, okay, what is our policies around how we established our breastfeeding club? Okay, we're offering our breastfeeding club from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock on a Tuesday, and our facility isn't easy to access and might be a need to pay for parking, right? And so if you look at that and say, all right, what might be impacting our turnout, where some of our policies are negatively impacting the group, this setup of the resource might be, okay, negatively impacting the group that might be working between the hours of 12 to 1, right? Negatively impacting the group that may not have readily accessible transportation that could make it to our location to attend. If there is payment for parking, it'll be impacting a group that may not have the funds available to pay for parking if there are other financial constraints that they might have. And so that's what we mean by delving into institutional implicit, right? That it's not necessarily policies that explicitly say that that we aren't trying to cater to X, Y, and Z group. That is not the case. What it is that it's very oftentimes unintentional, and that sometimes just looking at where we could be creating roadblocks as opposed to open roadways to resources is a essential piece to delve into. And so in coming back to this graph, or this picture of institutional racism and what we look at for that, once again, it's examining policies and practices within our own institutions for bias and then also advocating for large institutional change, right? And so what we've seen, and I say this quite often, is what we've seen with the implementation of, many of the baby-friendly hospital steps is that with the changes in some of the policies, right, on how mothers and infants are supported and how families are supported within the hospital context, that on the flip end of that is we are seeing this narrowing of the breastfeeding initiation gap, right, the skin to skin and so on and so forth, that we are seeing real-time change. And on a structural level, developing new policies driven by those most impacted, develop coalition and advocacy strategies that build power for communities, and developing new narratives and stories, right? That structural change. And as I mentioned at the top of the talk, that in doing through Rose, in doing the community transformer trainings, that being able to see how many mothers now raise their hand on receiving breastfeeding education from their provider or breastfeeding information from their provider is an example of how these new narratives are changing, right? And so this is why the work around policies and looking at our institutions is vital. And so if we come back to the Mississippi 2018 Breastfeeding Report Card, and we look at, the fact that, once again, ever breastfed, those percentages have gone up. Breastfeeding at 6 months, those percentages have gone up. Breastfeeding at 12 months, those percentages have gone up. But another thing to look at is also the breastfed infants receiving formula before 2 days of age, right? And the numbers around live births occurring at baby-friendly hospital facilities. I know that percentage of live births at baby-friendly hospitals will definitely go up because of all the phenomenal work being done now. But it's also, to take a look at ways that we can meet the targets around reducing the number or percentage of infants receiving formula before 2 days of age, right? And so if these are collective goals around supporting our communities in advancing equity and breastfeeding resources and support, we have to be intentional about the kind of questions we ask ourselves, right? So what does the number say on who is getting supplement before 2 days of age, right? Did this family discuss breastfeeding with their provider during pregnancy? How accessible is breastfeeding support for this family after they discharge, right? Looking at the kind of questions we ask and seeing what the data is telling us around these kind of questions, and then also working collectively with our partners in the communities to identify what is the community saying around this issue and what are some solutions offered. This is the essential linkage between hospital and communities, and it's a bi-directional conversation. It has to go both ways, right? And so some of the work that Rose has been able to do with the Chance Project around community transformers is helping to gauge that connection between step 3 around the prenatal education and step 10 around the linkages of families to community resources at discharge, that community transformers and also other programs similar to doing community work in Mississippi area are important to bridging some of this. And so I wanted to take a moment to highlight some of the community transformers that are throughout Mississippi doing amazing work. Shalisa, she's in Clarksville, Mississippi area. Kimberly Johnson is in the Jackson, Mississippi area. Gina Willis is also in the Clarksdale, Mississippi area. Jacqueline is Clarksville, Mississippi area, and Natasha is Tupelo, Mississippi, so West Mississippi, Northeast Mississippi, sorry. And so each of these ladies, you know, are doing phenomenal projects within the community to help bridge some of the support for families coming outside of, you know, being discharged from the hospital and needing those community resources to help them on their breastfeeding journey. And so what do Rose Community Transformers do? So part of our work with CHAMPS has been training these phenomenal ladies. So this is a picture from Biloxi, Mississippi. Training these phenomenal ladies on being able to provide basic breastfeeding support. And in receiving this training, they're able to do mother-to-mother or lead breastfeeding gatherings called breastfeeding clubs, and also can serve as partners in this collaborative work to bridge the support between families leaving the hospital and returning back home into their community. And so the MS Sip It Up hashtag was created by Community Transformers at a Community Transformer training in Mississippi. And thus far, some of the training locations that we have the opportunity of doing training is in Jackson, Greenwood, Columbus, Biloxi, and Waynesboro. And as of now, we have 72 total community transformers trained in the Mississippi area. And many of them are trying to figure out how they can bridge with hospitals and also the other community resources to be able to support families. So that sometimes is a question. So like I said, part of this talk is all of us working collectively. So sometimes knowing who to contact would be helpful in bridging this, bridging the resources. For the 2017-2018 period, the Rose Community Transformers has had 2,644 contacts with families. And so once again, you know, a part of advancing equity and breastfeeding in our communities is ensuring that when creating this roundtable of action planning, that we have representation from multiple different partners, that we can learn what's going on in the community that might be creating a hurdle, but also being able to map out ways to address this, right? And so lastly, in moving the needle, you know, facts are not enough to change hearts and minds. You know, we need to couch facts with a broader frame to change hearts and minds. So the stories are important. The numbers only tell one portion, the data only tells one portion of the work, but the building of that relationship and the trust and really seeing where the needs are by assessing our communities and our surrounding communities of what the needs are can really contribute to continue to move the needle forward in Mississippi, because like I stated before, some phenomenal work is being done. Currently seeing those changes make a difference, and I want to also see those changes continue to broaden. So I hope these tools and some of this framework helps in the action planning and even your ability to have these discussions with colleagues or other partners. And I am now opening the floor to questions.
Andrea, thank you so much. That was great. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? We still have a few minutes left. Andrea, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you and Rose have planned for the Community Transformers trainings coming up this year.
Oh, certainly. So the important notion is sustainability. So there have been some exceptional community transformers that we have the privilege of knowing that we would like to train as
I'm still here.
community transformers, like training.
I'm
That
was
so they
kind of hurt.
So these individuals can continue to train ladies to be able to be CTs in the Mississippi area. So that is some of our next phases. So we can have some like leads in community transformer leaders in Mississippi that will act as direct resources and support to the continuing and growing body of community transformers in Mississippi.
That's great. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Does anybody have any last-minute questions before we sign off here?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, this is Kimmery Bug. I just wanted to also say, please just contact us if you have any questions or comments or concerns. We can always be contacted through CHAMP and through CHEER. And we also are going to have a big component that includes training significant others, partners, fathers and grandmothers this year with our train the trainers in Mississippi.
And I just received a question for you, Andrea. Someone has asked for you to explain a little bit about cultural roadblocks. For example, they have found generational roadblocks where if the mother did not breastfeed, the mother will not. Or like, I think they mean if a mom didn't breastfeed, then when her daughter becomes a mother, the daughter does not feel comfortable breastfeeding.
Got you. So a part of what we know is that there's a need of healing, right? Because in this process, you know, for the grandmother, for whatever roadblocks she may have faced and maybe not getting the adequate support in her journey in nursing or didn't get the information, that when her daughter begins to go on her breastfeeding journey, there's sometimes there's a need of healing because it might feel that, one, we don't want to challenge, you know, the grandmother's womanhood, and there might be guilt kind of associated with what her experience was. And so the work that we try to do in that healing space is, you know, you did the best for grandmother. You did the best that you could do with what you knew how to do. And bringing her along this journey on the importance of breastfeeding, you know, what it would mean for not only the health of her daughter, but her new grandchild, right? Because at the end of the day, everyone wants healthy babies. And so in being sensitive to what past trauma may have existed and in handling that with care, and also creating a relationship and opportunity for learning and helping grandmother understand like how she can now assist her daughter on this journey can be a part of that healing process. So it is definitely that relationship building, because there are, you know, for some families, generations of mothers that may not have breastfed. And even in our CT training, you know, we've heard the ladies say that they are the first in their family to breastfeed, right? And so part of that is a little bit of the healing conversation and, you know, letting grandmother know that you are, you know, you did the best that you could do with what you knew. And, you know, we know you want a healthy grandchild. And so, you know, let's all work together in helping your daughter on this journey.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrea. If
No
anybody else has
problem.
any questions, please direct them to Andrea or Kim Marie at Rose. I'm sure they would be happy to answer anything else that you have to ask.
That's it. Thank you all.
Thank you.